Just to start off, I just wanted to ask you, being in all the organizations in the National Hockey League that you've been a part of, what is it that your experience was that made it different or special or difficult to be part of the Toronto Maple Leafs organization?
Well, first off, thanks for having me on. I loved working in Toronto. I obviously didn't get it done there, but I loved being a part of the Leafs and being a part of the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's a magical job. It's the only job of its kind in pro hockey. The closest thing would be Montreal, but it's the Vatican, and you're the GM of the Toronto Maple Leafs. It's a global brand. I mean, I told this story last week when we were doing the game at the Big House, and I got fired by the Leafs before we played that game. But Gary Bettman called me and said, we're worried about unemployment in Detroit. Can you sell 40,000 tickets to Toronto Maple Leafs fans for the game in Detroit? I said, I'll need 48 hours. Then he called me back. He said, can you sell 60,000? I said, I'll need 72 hours. We had ticket requests from 32 different countries. So, and I told the story again. After we won the Cup in 07, we opened the season in London. We played LA and London. And the first game, I went to the O2 Arena, and I went out and stood in the crowd and just watched the people come in. No one knew who I was, obviously. I'd say there were 4,000 people wearing NHL sweaters there in a crowd in London, England. I'd say half of them were Toronto Maple Leafs fans. So it's a global brand. It's crazy. So I loved working there. I didn't get it done, but I enjoyed it very much.
And I'm not sure if you're watching the Brad Treliving presser. I guess you're not because you're on with us. But he said this is different. It's the Toronto Maple Leafs, sort of what he said. And you can obviously speak to that. What can you tell us? Obviously, you know Brad Treliving very, very well.
Well, first off, he's very bright. Like, this is a guy who comes from money. Everyone knows who his dad is, but they were raised in a way they were taught to be respectful and they never gave them anything. He had to work for everything. He worked as a player. I remember his first training camp that I met him, he fought Gino Ojic, and the late, great Gino Ojic, Rosie will remember him. He was a tough man, and Tree fought him because he was trying to make a mark. It didn't go well for him, but he did a good job. He worked his ass off building up that league he worked in. He worked in the ECHL and got a reputation as a hard worker. Went to Phoenix as the assistant GM, worked under the league office because it was supervised by bankruptcy court then. So he's very bright to begin with. He's not afraid. He's a risk taker. He's not afraid. Look at the big deals he made last summer. I think it's the right fit for this job. I think it's a good hire.
That's good to hear. All qualities I think Leafs Nation appreciates for sure. Berkey, if you were to rewind the clock back and be in the position that you've already been in, but it was today, and you were to take the reins of this team right now, what would be your first order of business, and what do you think that team needs to have success in that market?
Well, my first order of business would be sit down with Austin Matthews. If the press conference is going on now, I'd be headed to Pearson right after, or maybe they use private planes there. I don't know. But I'd be heading to sit down with Austin Matthews. That'd be number one. I'd tell Sheldon Keefe, we'll get to you. You're going to have to wait a week or two while we sort this out and then see what happens next. But I don't think it's that. Everyone says, oh, what are they going to do? They got a month. A month is a long time.
It is. And I think ultimately people are trying to figure out the strengths, the weaknesses of Brad Treliving. I'd love for you to speak as somebody, obviously, who's been a longtime executive in this league, how important the team is, because everybody likes to put emphasis on sort of the GM, but the AGMs are just as important, are they not?
Yeah, they are. I mean, I said this in my book, which I'm sure you both read. I said that Bob Murray's name is on the Stanley Cup in Anaheim as the assistant GM, but he deserves his own place in the Cup. He had more to do with that Cup team than any assistant GM ever. The team is important. The coach is important. The scouts are important. The assistant GM is important. And I sense they've got good people there now. So I'm not sure how much dismantling Tree's going to have to do. Probably have to bring in a guy or two. You got to get someone in there right away that you trust completely. But short of that, I would guess there'd be some staff turnover with Kyle too now. Some staff turnover, but hopefully not much. 1 year in Toronto, the Leafs fired 14 guys to work for me in one day. 14 guys with families all lost their jobs the same day. I never forget it. Never done that before in my life. Never will.
Tough business, all right. But speaking of the head office there in the brass, we've been talking about Dubas and Shanahan and whether there's a power struggle there. Now with Dubas going in, being the president, who will their GM be? Can you tell us a little bit about, when you're putting a brass together and you've been part of them at all different levels and positions, how does that work? And is it always different, or is it always an understanding or a conversation over who has the ultimate say, who has the final say, who has the power? Is it GM, president? Is that ever a problem, and how does that work?
Yeah, Rosie, I think that's the $1 million question when you're doing a 3-man or 2-man staff. Most teams have a GM, and then everyone's below him. A couple teams like Columbus, when I was in Calgary, the way we had in Pittsburgh, and now it looks like Kyle, have a president of hockey operations. And you do have to have final say. But the first time that you get to an impasse and say that, say, Rosie, you're the GM and I'm the president of hockey operations, you come to me and say, I want to make this trade, and I say, no, I'm vetoing that trade, I might as well start looking for a new GM. So the way to do it, when I worked for the late, great Ken King in Calgary, you remember Ken King, Rosie? Ken said to me when he hired me in Calgary, he said, imagine we're business partners. So you're the president of hockey operations. You've got final say, but you're not going to walk in and say, I'm firing Joe Smith tomorrow. You're going to tell me a week before, I'm thinking of firing this guy. You're not going to walk in and tell me I'm taking a month off of vacation. You're going to tell me I'd like to take some time off. There's a way to work to it. And with Tree and I, it never got to that. It never got to that in Pittsburgh where I had to say no. This I'm saying no. You say no early enough that it doesn't get to an impasse. So the GM would call you and say, I'm really thinking of trading, Brian Burke for Jay Rosehill. And the GM says, President of Hockey Operations said, I don't think that's a good idea. Let's look at something else. And you move on.
It's just as simple as that. I was going to ask you a follow-up to that. Like, what did you make of the whole thing last couple of weeks? I guess obviously it's been, 13 days now since Brendan Shanahan came out with the news on that Friday. But what did you make of the whole thing leading up to that between Dubas and Shanahan?
Well, to me, just looking at it from the outside in and knowing a little bit more than most people do, it looked like they were headed back toward getting engaged again. And after they were eliminated, they had a couple of conversations. They talked to Kyle's agent, and it looked like it was moving toward bringing him back. And then the first rift I saw was when Kyle met with the media, despite the fact that Brendan Shanahan had said, I am not going to meet with the media, and I'd prefer you not. And he had that meeting anyway, and that's his prerogative. I'm not being negative, but the fact of the matter is, he said for the first time, I'm not sure I want to come back. Now, me, as a president of hockey operations, I can never hear those words spoken without my ears pricking up. Like, well, you just said you might not come back as GM. You just said that. All our players heard it. How do you come back from that? So that was one. Then the next day, apparently, they had a meeting, and they changed their proposal in terms of the power, call it reporting, call it streamlining, whatever. But basically, how the team would operate, and they made an increased amount of. They asked for a lot more money, apparently. Well, either one of those things, when you've already moved a ways down the track, and you think you're moving toward a deal, and now it moves left, it takes a left turn all of a sudden, alarm bells go off. So at that point, Shanahan's saying, wait a second. I thought we were moving toward a deal. Now we're moving the opposite direction. No chance. And at that point, you got to tell your owners what's going on. So I think it was a double whammy, and there's no chance after that.
Yeah, it makes sense that relationship got straighted at the end of the term for sure. Going specifically, Berkey, to the Toronto Maple Leafs this year. What do you think about the core four? Would you keep them together? You know how much money those guys are going to command here over the next coming years. It's proven that they haven't been able to, reach the finish line in the playoffs. What are your thoughts on keeping those four together?
Well, I think it's one thing I can say about this is I can address this because I addressed it in real time. I was working at Sportsnet when it started with Nylander. I said it's too much money. The sequence is wrong. They should have done this in an inverse sequence, an inverse order of signing. They overpaid Nylander. Now they guaranteed Marner to be overpaid, guaranteed Austin Matthews to be overpaid. So I called it out in real time. In my mind, 4 guys making $40 million isn't going to work. Even if the cap goes up, it's not going up by more than $1.5 million. It ain't going to work. So it's got to change. And one guy is untradeable. The other 2 guys are too valuable. I think it's got to be Nylander. Now, in my mind, and by the way, he's become valuable to the point where he's no longer overpaid, in my view. I think he was, but his performance the last 2 years, he's been a solid playoff performer, solid regular season performer. And it's time, I think, to move on and get those assets there and get your cap down.
And there's no real good way to do it. You got a guy that doesn't have value and you move him, you don't get much for him. You get a guy that has high value, you're going to get heat from the market for trading a guy that did well recently. It's a tough place to be in, I imagine.
Yeah, except you can't think that way in Toronto. You're wrong no matter what you do. You're going to be stupid by split the vote. Right? I used to say in Montreal, you're stupid twice because you're stupid in French and stupid in English. But in Toronto, everything is criticized, scrutinized. If there's 100 people that write a column on it, like they used to go after Dion, they used to go after Phil Kessel, they used to go after me, and just the number of rocks that hit you in the head, that piles up. So, you just got to do what you think is best. You have to ignore the white noise. The one thing I was successful in doing, I never paid any attention to the white noise.
And lastly, Berkey, just your thoughts on Kyle Dubas ending up in Pittsburgh here.
Well, Kyle Dubas is a good guy, and Pittsburgh's a great city. I really enjoyed working there. My girlfriend and I both just said the same thing before we came on the air. We loved working there. The only thing we're unhappy about with Fenway is that we didn't get to finish the job. We would have loved to stay and see it get done there. But no, the fact of the matter is it's a great city. They've got some great pieces in place. You got a great captain. I wish Kyle every success. I hope he has great luck there.